Well, if you remember, in the previous chapter, Moses, and again, Moses is the writer of the book of Genesis, and he writes about Joseph and how Joseph was betrayed, and then his death was faked by his brothers. Remember when they brought his tunic of many colors and they smeared it with goat's blood and said, "Hey, we found this in the wilderness. Is this your son's?" And so they lied to their father about Joseph being dead. And you remember when Joseph was in Egypt, he was accused of a heinous crime by Mrs. Potiphar. And then he was thrown into prison and the prison guard. But then we read that he found favor with Pharaoh because he interpreted Pharaoh's dream when no one else could. And because of that, Joseph was then made second in command over Egypt. And just as Joseph interpreted to Pharaoh through his dream, a famine came upon the land and upon the world. And with the wisdom that Joseph had, he ordered a tax of 20% over all the grain during the 7 years of plenty. So 20% would go to the storage, and then you could spend the other 80%. And because Egypt had stored enough grain during the time of plenty, Egypt had enough food for themselves and for others around the world. And again, going back a little bit, Genesis 42 discusses how Joseph's brothers, they come to Egypt and search for food because they're starving in the land of Canaan. And when Joseph sees them, again, the brothers don't know it's Joseph, they begin to accuse him. Or Joseph begins to accuse him of being spies, and so he throws them into prison. Then he takes them out of prison, and then he imprisons his brother Simeon. And then he demands that they would come and return with their youngest brother, Benjamin. By the way, Benjamin, don't think of Benjamin as like some 12-year-old boy. We actually read in chapter 46 how he had, I think, like 10 sons. So he's a man. So, hey, bring your youngest brother, Benjamin, and then it'll prove to me that you're truthful. Well, they come back, and then Joseph throws a party for his brothers, and then he plants a secret silver cup in Benjamin's bag, and then he accuses him of stealing from him. And then when Joseph's going to say, "Hey, I'm taking Benjamin as my own, and he's going to be my slave," Judah says, "Hey, don't take Benjamin. We promised our father that nothing would happen to him. Instead, take me." And Joseph sees there's been a change within his brothers. And then that's when Joseph finally reveals himself to them. Says, "Hey guys, it's me. It's Joseph." Maybe he's like taking off the makeup and he takes off the wig and says, "Hey, it's me. Your long lost brother after 22, 23 years." And then chapter 45, it discusses how the brothers, they go back to the land of Canaan with this good news. And they also bring with them a huge caravan of blessings that Joseph had given the family. And the brothers, they tell their father Jacob that Joseph is alive. Well, how is he alive? Well, we faked his own death. You what? Let me tell you about that. And that's the context of what's going to happen in chapter 46. So let's start with the first verse. By the way, it's a lot of passages to get through, so I'm not going to read every single verse. Some of the parts I'm just going to summarize, but some I will read and expound upon. Well, starting in verse 1, it says, "So Israel," who's Israel? Jacob. "So Israel took his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, 'Jacob, Jacob.' And he said, 'Here I am.' So he said, 'I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there.'" And again, highlight that point. Do not fear to go to Egypt. "I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. And Joseph will put his hand on your eyes." Verse 5, "Then Jacob arose from Beersheba," verse 6, "and went to Egypt, Jacob and all his descendants with him." So chapter 46, it starts off with Israel. And again, as we just said, Jacob traveling with his family. And they arrive in the place called Beersheba. And they offer sacrifices to the Lord. You don't know where Beersheba is? I didn't know before I studied this. Well, Beersheba, it's in the southernmost part of the land of Canaan. So this is Jacob's last stop, I should say, before stepping out to go to Egypt. This is the end of the promised land. This is where he is. And Jacob leaving Canaan to go to Egypt was not something likely to take. He's leaving the promised land to go to Egypt. Because if you remember back in the day, or a couple chapters earlier, in Genesis chapter 12, we read about Abraham going to Egypt. And when Abraham went to Egypt, a lot of bad things happened. He lied about his wife Sarah being his sister. No, she's not my wife. She's my sister. And then Pharaoh takes Sarah into his harem. And you remember how the Lord forbade his dad, Jacob's dad, Isaac, from going down to Egypt during the famine in Genesis chapter 26. So this is not something that he's just like, yeah, let's just go to Egypt. He's remembering, every time my family goes to Egypt, something bad happens. And now Jacob, he's an old man. He has his entire clan of 70 people, and he's facing an agonizing question. Is moving to Egypt abandoning the Lord? Is it abandoning God's promise, or is it fulfilling it? And before crossing into foreign territory, this is why Jacob, he stops in Beersheba, the end of the promised land, and he offers sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Why? Because he's seeking approval from the Lord before taking his family past the boundary of the promised land. And likewise, guys, just a short application of principles, but we need to seek the Lord when we come to a season in our life when we feel it's coming to a close. When the bow is about to be tied, we need to be seeking the Lord in that, searching for the next call. Guys, just because a door opens in your life doesn't mean you need to automatically walk through it. The Lord opens a lot of doors. The Lord opens a lot of opportunities for us, but he also closes a lot of doors. And especially shouldn't walk through a door without seeking the Lord in prayer. You know, I'll give a little example in my life. When I was 18 years old, I just moved back from California, and I lived in D.C. for a little bit. I came back here, and I was part-time here at the staff. I was doing construction here and did a little bit of the radio. And then I had the opportunity. I got a call from a pastor that I knew, and he said, hey, Josh, I need a worship leader. Do you want to come and move down to South Carolina? We'll pay you the big bucks. I'll make sure your house is paid for the first 2 years of your ministry, and you can start. And again, that was exciting for an 18-year-old. Man, I love worship. I get to move somewhere else. You know, South Carolina is a pretty nice place. And I sought the Lord. And the Lord answered and said, no. I was like, why, Lord? This seems good. I'm dating Emily. You know, if I move down now, I can marry her, you know, in a week or two from now. But it wasn't what the Lord had. And guys, just because something is good, or maybe just because something is biblical, maybe it's not even sinful, does not mean it's the Lord's will for your life. And this is why, believers, we need to be taking all things to the Lord in prayer. Well, that seems good, so why wouldn't I do it? Well, maybe it's not the Lord. And this is why Jacob, he's stopping. It seems good to go to Egypt, but I want to make sure this is the Lord's will and the direction he's leading me and my family. And so Jacob offers sacrifices to the Lord. And as he's sleeping, the Lord comes to him in a vision, in a dream. And what does he tell Jacob? He says, Jake, don't be afraid. Jacob, don't be afraid to go to Egypt. And the Lord promises him, the Lord reaffirms the covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, that you will become a great nation in the land of Egypt. And we can see from the Lord's words that Jacob was afraid. Jacob, don't be afraid. Why? Because he was afraid. He's leaving the promised land, the land that the Lord had promised to his forefathers, and now he's leaving because of the famine. And no doubt he's wondering, is this the end of the promise? I guess it was good when it lasted, you know, just a couple generations, and I have a great nation. I mean, I have 70 in my family. I guess that's big, generally speaking. But it's not as many as the stars in the sky as the Lord had promised, or the sea, the sands upon the shore. But the Lord speaks to Jacob. And he says, hey, I'm going to be with you. My promise is not broken. My promise will not cease because you are leaving this land. And guys, the Lord's promises, they often require for you to step out the boundary of comfort. And often into seasons of uncertainty. But know this, guys, the Lord is with you. There are promises, guys. There are calls. There are works the Lord has in store for you, for each and every single believer. And sometimes, for that call, for that mission, for that promise to be fulfilled, the Lord requires you to take a step of faith into the unknown. You know, we read a lot about people going out to the unknown. Abraham, and what does the Lord say? Go out to the unknown. Which land? To a land I will show you, okay? Even his father Isaac, when Isaac leaves, he says, go to the unknown. And that's when he spends time with Laban. And now, here's Jacob, kind of going to the unknown. You know, oftentimes we want the Lord just to fulfill the promise, fulfill the good work that you're going to do in my life. But we don't want the testing and the faith that comes along with that. Why? Because the unknown is scary. And here Jacob is. Jacob, by the way, he's 130 years old at this point. He's not some young, spry fellow. He's settled. He probably has his IRA, coming on in. He's comfortable in the land of Canaan. And he's afraid. I don't want to die in Egypt. But the Lord calls him. Jacob had to leave a familiar promise, in the case of promised land, to receive the fulfilled promise. To see Jacob alive, to keep his family from starving. And guys, the step into Egypt, as terrifying as it may be, was necessary for Jacob, for the preservation of God's people, and for the promise to be fulfilled. Again, as I just mentioned, think of Abram. When the Lord called Abraham, what was Abraham doing before he started walking with the Lord? He was worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars. He was worshiping those gods out there. And the Lord said, who am I going to choose? I'll choose this idolatrous worshiper. Abraham, I'm calling you. To where? To a place I don't even know. I'll name it soon. But come and follow me. That's a little scary. Leave your family. Leave your father's household. Leave your security. And I will show you a new place. And guys, what's my point? God's promises are rarely fulfilled in passive and static environments. Receiving what the Lord has promised almost always demands you leaving, stepping out of the routine, out of the familiar, out of thy identity. So a question I want to ask you guys. What is the Lord calling you to do in your life? As I just mentioned before, the Lord has had your destiny planned before the foundation of the world. We read that in Ephesians chapter 2. Works prepared for you long ago. Destiny is written. But the question still remains, are you willing to step out to fulfill that? You can imagine, Josh, I have this for your life. Okay, I'm so excited, but you have to step out. Oh, I don't know. It's a promise I'm giving you, but I don't know if I'm going to step out into the land of Canaan and to go to Egypt because it's a little scary. Well, you have to be willing to step out past your comfort zone to walk in the fullness of what the Lord has planned for you. Guys, the Lord's sovereign promises do not eliminate the need for human obedience, but they demand it. A promise left on the shelf does no good for you. You can imagine the Lord saying, all right, here's your promise. All right, go and get it. I don't want to. It's right here. It's all yours. But it's scary. I don't know. It's going to take a lot out of me. We're called to step out and take and walk in what the Lord has promised for us. It says in Joshua chapter 1, verse 3. Cool verse here. The Lord is speaking to Joshua and he says, I promise you what I promised Moses. Wherever you set foot, you will be on land I have given you. So what's the promise the Lord gives Joshua here? Well, the promise the Lord gives to Josh saying, hey, the land is given to the people. This is all your land. This is the promise, and this is all for you, Josh. But there's action that's still required. And what was the action? The people needed to physically walk and take the land. And guys, when the Lord calls you into the unknown, again, take that step of faith. You may not know how it's all going to work out, but the Lord is faithful. And the Lord will fulfill every promise he has made to you. And this is what he's saying to Jacob. Hey, walk into this promise. Believers, we need to take note that the promises and the plans the Lord has in store for your life may not be the path you may think. I don't think I've ever shared my testimony. I'll give you like a 30-second synopsis. My path to ministry, I knew the Lord had called me into ministry around freshman, sophomore year of high school. And this is what happened. I gave up almost a full ride scholarship to go to one of the local colleges. And I decided, let me spend a ton of money and go across the country. I went across the country for a couple months, came back, lived in D.C., and I still knew the Lord was calling into ministry, but I had no idea what that looked like. Until one of the pastors here said, hey, Josh, we'll hire you for 10 hours for $10 an hour. $200 every paycheck. All right, why not? And then I did that for a couple years, but I was like, I feel like there's still more the Lord has for me. I did a lot. I led worship. I cleaned the church. I stacked up chairs. I set up chairs. I did a lot. I was a barista for a little bit during that time. I worked in the behavioral field. I worked at a hospital for a couple months. But I still knew, Lord, I feel like you've promised me this. You've given me this to take hold of, but I don't see what you're doing in my life. Until April, like March 22nd, somewhere around there. One of the pastors, Pastor Troy, came up to me and said, all right, Josh, you still called to ministry? I feel like that's what the Lord has promised me. All right, well, here's an opportunity. And praise the Lord, I'm here because of that. Now, is that what I thought was going to happen? Josh, you're going to work at Starbucks twice, you're going to work at the library, you're going to work at the hospital for a little bit, and you're going to do a bunch of other jobs. No, but I knew that's what the Lord had for me, and I just had to be faithful and walk in that. And so, guys, when the Lord gives you a vision, when the Lord gives you a calling, when the Lord gives you a promise, take note. Be aware of not marrying your step-by-step strategy on how the Lord needs to accomplish it. Lord, I know you called me to ministry, so I'm going to go to Bible college, and then I'm going to graduate, and then I'm going to get a six-figure job being a pastor. It's not typically how it works. And then believers, we can often fall into the rigid formula of, if the Lord promised me X, the Lord must do it by Y, because that's how math's, right? Well, think of David. You guys remember King David. He was anointed as king as a young boy around your age, tending his father's flock. David, I'm going to anoint you, and you will be king over Israel. Okay, I can't wait till that. And guess what? He had to wait 15 years. David was living as an outlaw with a bunch of bandits. He was fleeing King Saul's assassination attempts. But yet, through those 15 years of running away from his life, he still held on to the promise. And guess what? The Lord fulfilled that promise. So guys, hold on tightly to the Lord, to his promises. But hold loosely to your expected timeline and roadmap. Now, verses 8 through 27. I'm not going to read all that, but you can read it on your own time. It gives just the generations of Jacob's family and the names of everyone. And then verse 28 and through 30 of chapter 46. Then he sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out before him the way to Goshen. And they came to the land of Goshen. So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive. So Jacob, they leave Beersheba and they come to Egypt. And before they really go in, he sends one of his sons, Judah. Jacob does. And again, Judah was the one who suggested, hey, let's sell Joseph into slavery. So that's the Judah. But he was also Judah who said, hey, Joseph, Zephaniah, Paneah, don't take my brother Benjamin, take me instead. So that's this Judah. And we read that they come to the land of Goshen, right outside Goshen. It's located in northeast of Egypt, that Nile Delta. By the way, Goshen, it was a lush, a place to raise pastures. This place was fed by the Nile River, so it was an ideal place to raise cattle and sheep and of the sorts. And Joseph hears that, hey, there are a bunch of Canaanites, and they're here. Joseph's like, that's my family. So he gets on his Maserati and he drives down to Goshen. And that's where he arrives and he greets his father. And again, it's been close to 25 years since Joseph has seen his father Jacob. And they embrace in a warm way. Now, verse 31 through 34 talks about how Joseph is an intercessor. So Joseph tells his family, like, hey, I'm so glad you're here. Dad, it's so good to see you. However, I need to talk to Pharaoh because there's a lot of you. And I'll represent you so y'all can stay in the land of Goshen. By the way, there are a lot of typologies. What's a type? Well, Joseph is a type of Christ, or a parallel, an example of Jesus Christ. So I'm just going to go through a list real quick as we continue. But the first one is that Joseph is an intercessor. Again, why? Because Jacob's family cannot approach Pharaoh on their own merit. Jacob and his family couldn't just waltz up to the palace and say, we want to stay in the land of Goshen. No, they needed Joseph to stand in the middle, to stand in the gap. And in similar fashion, you all know humanity cannot approach just a holy God, and how Jesus is our advocate and our high priest. Well, in verses 1 through 6 of Genesis 47 now, we read that Joseph, he brings 5 men of his brothers, and they go to Pharaoh. And Joseph presents them to Pharaoh. And Joseph tells Pharaoh that, hey, they're from the land of Canaan, and they want to settle in Goshen, if that's okay with you. And Pharaoh asks, okay, what do you gentlemen do? What's your job? What's your occupation? And they reply, we are shepherds. Now, if you remember in one of our previous studies, the Egyptians did not like shepherds. They actually deplored shepherds. They hated them. The Egyptians were very clean. They were very modest. They had a very tranquil lifestyle, very orderly and refined. However, shepherds they were semi-nomadic. I describe them as like hippies. They're just living out there in the bush. They have long beards and tattered clothes, and they're raising cattle. And so Egyptians, again, they were very clean, very orderly. Shepherds were not that. By the way, we read this in Genesis. When shepherds would come into town, you would want to pull your daughter close because shepherds were not good people. So they say, we're shepherds. And the Egyptians are like, oh, okay. But what does Pharaoh do? Pharaoh says, all right, that's fine. Yeah, dwell in the land of Goshen. Yeah, dwell in the land of Egypt. And by the way, Pharaoh doesn't regulate Joseph's family to, you can stay here, stay in the slum. He says you can have the best part of land. Another typology we see here of Joseph is our inheritance through Christ. Again, the family received the best land. Why? Because they're related to Joseph. And likewise, believers receive an eternal divine inheritance solely through their union with the Lord. Now, verses 7 through 10, we read how Jacob, Joseph's father, blesses Pharaoh. And then verses 11 through 12, Joseph acted strictly as Pharaoh commanded. And he says, all right, guys, let's settle in the land. It reads here in verse 11 and 12, the land of Ramesses, just another name for the land of Goshen. And we read that Joseph takes care of his family's needs. He basically says, hey, I'm a big boy here in Egypt. If you need anything, let me know. Another typology we see here is that the bread of life. Just as Joseph saved his household from starvation, if you need food, let me know, and I will give you food. Again, he provided bread for his household. And likewise, Jesus Christ provides spiritual life through eternal nourishment to a starving world. And then verses 13 through 14. I'll read this. Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, for the grain which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So the famine wasn't just an inconvenience. What does Moses say? They languished. These two regions, Canaan and Egypt, were suffering. Because they're in a place, maybe not suffering, but in a place of desperation. And remember, Joseph sold grain to the people. And in doing so, Joseph absorbed all this money from both Egypt and Canaan. And then in verses 15 through 26, I'm going to skip around a little bit, but let me read, starting in verse 15. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed. Then Joseph said, give me your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock. Then verse 18, when the year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide from the Lord that our money is gone. My Lord also has our herds and livestock. And then verse 20, then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And then verse 22, on the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh. And verse 25, so they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of the Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So when all the money in Egypt and Canaan is exhausted, they've been using their money to buy bread, but now families are without money. All right, if we're without money, we have no bread. And so they go to Joseph. Joseph, we're about to starve to death. We have no money to buy any grain. So now we shift to a barter system. And so for 1 full year, Joseph sustains the population in exchange for their cattle, for their horses, for their donkeys, for their sheep. And then in the following year, after Joseph had all their cattle, the people voluntarily give their land. Joseph, buy our land so we can eat, so we can have food. So Joseph buys all the land for Egypt, in Egypt, I should say, for Pharaoh. And we read about some relocation and how Joseph is managing distribution and centralizing labor. And Joseph enacts a 20% tax as well, very much how he did in the beginning during the years of plenty. Also want to point out my last typology here that we see is that Joseph was a redeemer. Just as the Egyptians willingly surrendered their wealth, their land, and their lives to Joseph. Why? Because he alone had the bread of life. And likewise, believers willingly surrender their lives and resources and sovereignty to Jesus. And if you read verse 25, if you have your Bible, verse 25, it says, "You," talking about Joseph, "have saved our lives." It's a foreshadowing the song of the redeemed before Christ, which we'll read in Revelation chapter 5, verse 9 and 10. And then lastly, guys, this is the verse I'm going to focus on for the remainder of our time. Verse 27, "So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there and grew and multiplied exceedingly." So chapter 46 starts with introducing Jacob and his fear about the promise of being a mighty nation and leaving the land of Canaan. But again, as the Lord told him, don't be afraid. I'm going to make you into a great and mighty nation. And then we read chapter 47, verse 27. What does it say? "And they grew and they became exceedingly great." Their possessions, their people are multiplying in number. And here we have Egypt and the rest of the world. They're suffering. But here, the nation of Israel, they're being fruitful. They increase greatly in number. As this is important, and a principle I want to draw out is that nothing can stand against the Lord and his will from succeeding. God's promises, the Lord's even presence, are not confined to a particular place. They're not confined to a particular boundary. And wherever the Lord leads his people, the Lord is faithful. He's faithful to sustain them and accomplish his purpose. And when we find ourselves, in a difficult season of life, know this, guys, nothing can void the promise that the Lord has given you. God's power works through boundaries and through obstacles. Nothing can break the promises of the Lord, especially the promises that he has for his children. There are a lot of people who break promises. I bet a lot of you have had promises that have been broken to you. Whether maybe that's in a family member. Maybe it's your dad. And my dad broke that promise, that time. Or maybe it's your mom or a sibling or a friend. People break promises, but the Lord never does. And Jacob could find comfort in living this out. Again, chapter 46. Is this the end of the promise? And the Lord says no. And then chapter 47 we come, and Israel's a great nation. So here's a quick list of promises from the Lord to hold on to. Number 1, provision and care. Philippians chapter 4, verse 19. "And this same God who takes care of me will supply all your needs from his glorious riches, which you have given to us in Christ Jesus." The Lord provides for his people. The Lord provides for the birds of the air. Are we not worth more than they? Number 2, the Lord promises direction and wisdom. And I think a lot of people want this. Lord, I just need direction in my life. But where are you leading me to? Well, it says in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5, and says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding, but all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make clear your paths." And so when stepping into seasons of uncertainty, very much like Jacob, God promises to clear your path when you surrender your self-reliance. Hey, stop relying on yourself and what you're trying to do, Josh, but trust in me, and I will light up your path. Number 3, what does the Lord promise? The Lord promises you peace. Peace is so hard to come by today. Well, the Lord promises it. Isaiah 26, verse 3, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." By the way, true peace doesn't mean you're never going to have trouble in your life. But as you keep your focus and your gaze upon the Lord will protect your heart from that fear, from that anxiety, and he will give you peace. And lastly, I think probably paramount to this list is salvation. Paul writes in Romans 8, 38 and 39, I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love. Neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor demons. Neither our fears for today, nor our worries about tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. No power in the sky above or the earth below. Indeed, nothing in all creation will be able to separate you from the love of God that is revealed in Christ Jesus our Lord. Guys, no earthly crisis, no personal failure, no spiritual attack has the power to sever your bond with the Lord. Our destiny, is safely held in His hands. It's permanent. It's unbreakable. In verses 28 through 31, the end of the chapter of 47, Jacob asks his son Joseph, hey, promise me you're going to bury me in the promised land. And Joseph says, of course, Dad. So beyond the boundaries, and again, we did 2 chapters, chapter 46 and 47. It shows that Israel's transformation from a family of 70 into a nation, that we'll read later in Exodus, to millions. But that didn't happen through a comfortable, static, familiar life in the land of Canaan. It happened because an old, frightened man paused in Beersheba, pursued the Lord, laid his fear upon the altar, and took that step of faith in crossing the border to where the Lord was calling him to do. Guys, we worship and follow a God who is with us. And so a question I want to ask before we wrap up is, what border is the Lord asking you to cross? What promise, as I made the illustration, what promise is upon the shelf that requires you to step out of the boat, to take a step of faith, to trust in Him, and take for yourself? You know, there are a lot of promises, as I just mentioned, the Lord gives to us. The Lord promises you peace. It's like, Lord, I don't have peace in my life. Well, it's because you're holding on to resentment. It's because maybe you're avoiding a difficult conversation with one of your friends, or maybe you're holding back, and isolating yourself from your community because of past hurt. It's like, I don't have peace in my life. Well, the Lord promises you peace, but you got to step out and you got to make those relationships right. Or maybe the Lord promises you freedom. Maybe there's a sin. Maybe there's a struggle in your life that no one knows about. Your youth leaders don't know about. You lie to your parents about it. And, maybe it's out of shame or what people may think. It's like, Lord, I can't break the bonds. You promised me freedom, but there's no freedom to have. It's because you're hiding. It's because you're walking in fear. It's because you're walking in shame. The Lord promises, as we just mentioned, direction and clarity in your life. But here's the thing. You're waiting for a perfect, risk-free sign before taking obvious steps of obedience toward a new calling or to a new decision. Or maybe you're just needing rest. Like, Lord, you say you promised me rest. But, you're filling every hour with just the busyness of your life and work and distractions. Or the Lord promises you a new identity. But you continue to define yourself by your past mistakes, by your past failures, or even what people may say about you. The Lord also promised you salvation. But maybe you're trying to earn your salvation. Maybe it's through perfection or performance, or, secretly believing that your mistakes are too unlovable for the Lord. Well, beyond the boundary. That's the title of the message. What does that mean? Stop letting fear dictate your movements. But take that step of faith. Go beyond the boundary. And trust in the one who has called you, that He is faithful. The Lord is faithful. The Lord will hold you. The Lord will sustain you. The Lord will lead you beyond the boundaries into the fullness of His purpose.